Now a major update to a story 48 Hours has been following. A North Texas woman was found guilty yesterday in the 2011 shooting death of her husband. The report was featured on 48 Hours back in May. Correspondent Peter Van Zandt looks at the trial where his interview became a key piece of evidence.
Some cases don't start with a mystery. They start with a lie that slowly begins to come apart. And today, we're going to talk about a case that shook an entire community. A case where a woman claimed danger came from outside her home, while investigators quietly wondered if the real threat had been inside from the start. This is the story of Michele Williams, a woman who looked polished, confident, and in control. The kind of person who always had an answer ready and a smile to back it up. But beneath that smooth exterior was someone juggling secrets, debts, and stories that never seemed to match. And on one October night, everything she'd been trying to hide finally began to crack. And if you're just joining the channel, make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Before the night that changed everything, Michele Williams presented herself as a confident, polished woman who seemed to have her life in order. She carried a charm that made people trust her, and she projected an image of stability even when her past told a different story. Michele had moved through several relationships, and instability had followed her more than once. That history shaped her into someone who wanted control over her environment, her reputation, and her future. She smiled easily, but her stories often shifted when examined too closely. When she married Greg Williams, it appeared she had finally reached the stability she longed for. Greg was steady, hardworking, and deeply connected to his children, including his daughter Taylor from a previous marriage. He remained close with his ex-wife Kathy, something Michele struggled to accept. Tension between Michele and Kathy existed almost from the beginning. Kathy described Michele as someone who looked perfect on the surface, but hid something less consistent underneath. Michele, meanwhile, grew increasingly uncomfortable with Greg's closeness to his former family, especially as Taylor spent more time in their home. Their life together also wasn't as conventional as it appeared. Michele and Greg met through an online BDSM community, and their parties sometimes drew complaints from neighbors. Behind the suburban calm, there were cracks of jealousy, resentment, and a constant pressure to maintain an image that didn't fully match reality. Greg, however, remained grounded and dependable, a man who provided and stayed present for his family. Michele wanted that same stability, but the tension inside the home kept pulling the foundation apart. What looked like a stable marriage from the outside was already fragile within a calm surface covering deeper fractures. From the outside, the Williams family looked stable. A comfortable home, a successful husband, and a wife who carried herself with confidence. But behind closed doors, the reality wasn't as smooth as the picture suggested. Greg's business brought in money, but it also brought pressure. There were loans to manage, bills that lingered longer than expected, and a lifestyle that demanded more than the finances always supported. Michele, who had tasted instability throughout her life, felt every fluctuation deeply. She wanted security, control, certainty, and when things wavered, so did her patience. Inside the home, tensions quietly built. Arguments surfaced over money, over expectations, over decisions made without agreement. Small disagreements hardened into accusations, and stress lingered in the spaces between conversations. What neighbors saw as a peaceful family life often masked a much heavier atmosphere, one filled with frustration, resentment, and uncertainty. Michele maintained a polished exterior, but the pressure underneath grew. Greg, steady as he appeared, had his own flaws and habits that complicated the relationship. Their marriage became a constant balancing act between the image they wanted to present and the reality they struggled to manage. And as the stress mounted, certain questions began to take shape. Questions about finances, about control, about the insurance policies tucked quietly in the background. Seeds of motive, subtle at first, were planted inside a home where the calm facade no longer matched the tension underneath. What looked like a normal marriage from the street had become fragile, strained, and increasingly difficult to hold together a house of calm on the outside, but cracking quietly within. The night Greg Williams was murdered began like any ordinary evening. Greg and Michele took their daughter, Taylor, to her choir concert. Greg filmed the performance, hugged her goodbye, and kissed her on the cheek, a simple moment of family warmth. Then the couple grabbed dinner at Taco Bueno, and drove back to their quiet Keller home, a neat suburban house that looked peaceful from the outside. Inside, the house felt just as calm, tidy, comfortable, and ordinary. Nothing hinted that the night would end in tragedy. But when police arrived before dawn, the calm felt wrong. Greg lay on the bed, a gun beside him, but the room looked unnaturally still. Michele, who had called 911, had only minor injuries. Her voice trembled, but her story wavered in small details, just enough to raise questions. When investigators examined the physical evidence, the contradictions became sharper. Blood spatter patterns hinted at a close-range shot. The trajectory of the bullet suggested someone had been standing near Greg, not an intruder firing from a distance. And the overall condition of the room, too clean, too calm, felt inconsistent with the chaos Michele described. Every clue seemed to whisper the same possibility. The scene had been altered. Detectives exchanged glances, the kind formed when intuition and evidence align. Nothing in the room matched the story of a break-in. Nothing matched a sudden attack. Instead, each detail pointed toward deliberation, toward a narrative being shaped after the fact. The more they looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't a crime scene left behind in panic. It was a crime scene someone had tried to reconstruct, to reshape, to hide something. And in that quiet bedroom, suspicion began to grow slowly at first, then unmistakably, because the evidence wasn't telling the story Michele had given. As detectives looked closer, one thing became obvious. Michele Williams didn't have one story. She had many. At first, she said an intruder broke in and shot Greg. Her voice shook as she described chaos and fear. But the house told a different story. No forced entry, no broken locks, no disturbance at all. Even the canine units found nothing. The home felt sealed and untouched. Hours later, Michele changed her story. This time, she claimed Greg had taken his own life. But the forensics disagreed. The blood pattern, the shot angle, the placement, nothing matched a self-inflicted wound. Then came the third version. Michele admitted she cleaned the bedroom because she panicked and wanted to protect her daughter. But to the investigators, the details felt too controlled, too neat. It sounded less like panic and more like a story being rewritten every time the last one failed. At the Keller police station, everything unraveled. Greg had been shot in the head while lying in bed. A .45 caliber gun supposedly used by an intruder was found near the back door beside a wrench. Both were wiped clean. No fingerprints, no forced entry, and the $20,000 kept in the house was untouched. Michele claimed a man dressed in black knocked her out with the wrench before shooting Greg and running out the back. Their 4-year-old daughter slept through everything. Michele was the only witness, and the only voice telling a story the evidence refused to support. As detectives pulled the case apart, one thing stood out. The forensics didn't match Michele's stories. Greg Williams had been shot at close range, something no intruder narrative could explain. The trajectory, the patterns, the placement of the gun all pointed to someone standing right beside him. Michele tried to fill the gaps. She said Greg had taken his own life, and that she cleaned the room and even hit herself with a wrench because she panicked and wanted to protect her daughter. It was dramatic, but it didn't fit the evidence. Officers doubted her from day one, yet with no physical link tying her to the shooting, they couldn't charge her with murder. She was arrested only for filing a false report and sent home. Meanwhile, the investigation widened. Phone records, financial documents, text messages, and testimonies from friends and family revealed small contradictions. Nothing huge alone, but together they formed a troubling pattern. Prosecutors began shaping these pieces into a story built on circumstantial evidence but strong in consistency. And when the media caught wind of it, Michele was labeled the Black Widow, a name that stuck to her calm exterior and the violent truth forming beneath it. With each new detail, detectives grew more certain. The answers weren't in dramatic moments, they were in the quiet clues Michele couldn't control. By the time Michele Williams finally went to court in 2013, the whole community was watching. Greg's close friends sat through every hearing, especially Rob Conover, who had known him for more than 20 years. Rob said Michele had a way of performing for the room, acting shaken, asking officers to escort her out after each session, like she was terrified. Everything with her was an act, he said. Inside the courtroom, two completely different stories unfolded. Prosecutors argued that Michele had shot Greg, cleaned the scene, lied repeatedly, and had a financial motive pointing to the life insurance policy taken out just 2 months before his death. To them, her behavior looked controlled, calculated, and rehearsed. The defense pushed a different picture, a scared woman overwhelmed by trauma. They suggested Greg might have taken his own life, and said Michelle's frantic cleaning was just panic. They reminded the court that no fingerprints, no DNA, and no physical evidence tied her to the gun. Testimonies added tension. Greg's family believed something darker was happening, especially Kathy Williams, who suspected Michele had been having an affair with Gene Wallace. If Greg found out, Kathy said, he would have left her. She'd lose everything. Then came the twist. On October 9, 2013, Michele avoided a full murder trial by taking a plea deal not for murder, but for evidence tampering and deadly conduct. She faced up to 20 years, but her sentencing was pushed to April 21, 2014, because she was pregnant with twins. Greg's family felt the deal was far too soft. His son called Michele a professional manipulator. Rob added, "You can get away with murder in Texas if you know how to clean it up." In the end, no jury ever heard the full case. Michele walked away with a 20-year sentence, one she could cut in half with good behavior. Plenty of time, they feared, for her to rewrite her story all over again. Even after Michelle's plea deal, nothing about the case felt fully resolved. Greg's family walked away with a mix of relief and frustration, relieved she finally faced consequences, yet frustrated that the truth still felt only half told. Friends like Rob Conover said Michele had a way of manipulating everyone around her, even convincing officers she needed protection. And in the community of Keller, people struggled to understand how a couple who looked so stable from the outside could unravel in such a devastating way. Even with all the testimony and evidence, one thing still lingers. No one knows the full story of what truly happened that night. Michele may serve her sentence and eventually walk free, but the questions left behind about motive, manipulation, and what Greg knew before he died continue to hover over everyone who loved him. And with that, we come to the end of this story. A case built on shifting truths, missing answers, and a tragedy that still echoes years later. Thanks for watching, and I hope you stick around for more true crime stories that dive deep into the mysteries that stay with us long after the headlines fade.